You see, I told you I'd be back soon. So, it's been just over a week since I recorded the last one of these, but I've been enjoying a lovely and welcome break after Alien Biospheres Part 11. Still making videos in the meantime, but compared with the amount of stress I put myself through for Alien Biospheres, it's effectively a vacation by contrast. And now I am firmly within the linguistics headspace, so I thought I might as well strike while the iron is hot and do some conlanging today. But before we start, not only would I like to say thank you once again to the patrons, but also, in case you missed the announcement video, I have officially decided to do a Q&A in celebration of reaching 100,000 subscribers. So if you have any burning questions you want to ask me, post them in the comment section of that video, and if I feel I have an interesting or relevant answer, I will provide one. I don't know exactly how long it's going to take me to edit this episode, and when it's going to come out relative to the Q&A announcement video, but I'm pretty sure by the time this episode comes out, there will still be plenty of time to ask questions. So, make of that what you will. And now, to kick things off, I've got a little bit of a surprise to show you. Voila! So I think I said ages and ages and ages ago, I do all of the initial sketching and essentially the rough draft, just playing around with all the ideas I have and just getting a general understanding of how the language works in Excel. But once we get to the point of filling in all the details and finalizing some of these decisions, I begin a sort of formal write-up in Excel. So you can see here I've roughed in, it's essentially just an empty template at this point. I've written down just some very basic information and ported over a couple of the tables. But going forward, we'll start to jump back and forth between the spreadsheet to just continue messing around with the various ideas, and then we'll slowly start filling stuff in the actual reference grammar. It's all coming together. So, in the meantime, I've got a lot of follow-up to cover from the last episode. First of all, I've been sorting out the noun declensions. I went back, fixed some of the errors that I found, changed a few forms here and there, but the big thing is that I made a decision about whether or not the dual and the singulative affects the stress. And I ultimately decided that it does. I was initially a little bit reticent to do that, just because it seemed a bit strange to me that a monosyllabic, very light suffix would affect a stress shift. But I did a little bit of looking around, and it seems that that is a thing that happens, where sometimes clitics or other small elements that get tacked onto the end of things can actually pull the stress back. I'm pretty sure that's what happens with the que suffix in Latin, actually. So if you had a word like populus, which is people, and stuck the que clitic at the end to make and the people, it wouldn't keep the stress as populusque. I'm pretty sure it would be populusque. The que would actually shift the stress all the way to what would have been the final syllable of the original stem. And there are other languages that do similar things, so I figured I could get away with doing it here. And I found that overall, shifting the stress just gave more euphonic or interesting forms, at least to me. But I was also thinking about the idea of potentially having another stress shift happen to re-regularize everything, where after all of this has happened, the stress changes to where it now falls on a long or closed penult and the antepenult otherwise, something like that. But then I realized I don't want to do that because that would mess with some of our auxiliaries, which, by the way, I went through and I marked the stress for them as well. So like Sivan, which is one of my favorites, if we affected that stress shift, it would be Sivan, which doesn't sound nearly as good. Now, I might still play around with the idea of maybe the stress now falls on the closest closed syllable to the end of the word, maybe? But I will think about that more in due course. You'll see also I've just in general cleaned up the document and got rid of a lot of the old notes we had, because we're going to need some space as we decline some more nouns. And I also realized I made a mistake with the inanimates, because last time I made the singulative suffix kya with the palatal stop so that it could give us a final Y sometimes and then an S other times. But then I remembered that we were going for this pseudo-inverse number system, where we want the inanimate singular to look similar to the animate plural, which really is more of a cosmetic thing than anything else, but I still kind of like the idea. And plus, the dual came from Lü, and the palatal L had exactly the same alternation, where sometimes it's L and sometimes it's Y, and it does feel just a little bit contrived to have both the dual and the singulative come from the two palatal sounds that happen to sometimes turn into a Y in various places. For them to both have exactly the same alternation just seems a little bit too convenient. So I've changed it back to xia, and changed the forms of the inanimate singulars accordingly. But one thing that I brought up ages ago, and kind of forgot about, is the concept of differential object marking for inanimates. So I may or may not have explained this before, but in a lot of languages, the case that is assigned to the direct object of a verb will depend on certain semantic properties of the direct object, with the most common instances involving animacy and or definiteness. So without any other context, if I said, I rock C, just based on those words, even without word order or any other marking to help you out, you can probably be safe in assuming that I'm the one that's doing something to the rock, and not the other way around. Like, if the rock is seeing me, then we've got bigger problems. So in a lot of languages that have case marking, if the direct object is inanimate, then that won't be overtly marked. It'll just remain in whatever the unmarked case is, which is usually the nominative. Whereas if I were to say, I dog see, now it's a little bit more ambiguous. Like, the word order helps out, but it might still lead to some confusion, or it might still need some clarification. So in that case, if the direct object is animate, only then does it take the accusative case. And languages like Turkish and Amharic, and I believe Hebrew as well, do this same sort of alternation, except it's dependent on definiteness instead. So I see a dog, the dog would be in the nominative, and you only apply the accusative if the dog is definite. Now, I'm not particularly fussed about definiteness in this language, because that's part of the benefit of our pseudo-Austronesian alignment valency changing topic jumping system, is that we can just shuffle the arguments around based on their prominence and salience anyway, which is effectively a way of marking definiteness. But when it comes to animacy, it could be that in the proto-lang, inanimate nouns just never had the accusative case marker associated with them. If it was just purely recoverable by context that they were the direct object, then they just don't take the accusative marker. But the cool thing is, since we have our cool case alternation switch-up thing that happens once auxiliary verbs get involved, where the old genitive becomes the new accusative, and the old accusative now becomes the locative, or a general sort of postpositional case, that instead means, as long as we go with this idea, that for inanimate nouns, the nominative and locative forms will be identical. I think that's pretty cool, because most of the time you'd expect the nominative and accusative for inanimates to be the same or similar. Like, I'm pretty sure in Latin, in the third declension, if I'm remembering correctly, the nominative and accusative are the same for neuters. But in this case, it's the locative, and it just seems kind of weird that those two cases would be conflated, but it makes perfect sense. And that would also give us the advantage of not needing to use this bigger, bulkier form in adpositional phrases. Instead of saying irnynre, we can just say irnys. So it makes the whole thing a bit simpler and more streamlined. The only thing that makes me hesitate with this idea is that I do kind of like that NR cluster in there that we have for the locative singular. That nr ending is quite nice. I like that cluster for this language. But we'll be able to get plenty more NR clusters down the line. So I think I'm just going to go ahead and make the locative and the nominative identical. So with that done, I think our first batch of nouns is now finally finished. But before we make some more nouns, there are a few other things I wanted to cover. First of all, with regards to the somewhat crazy Valency system that I proposed in the last episode, the more I've thought about it, the more I like it. So I think unless someone can provide some evidence that what I've proposed just violates the laws of linguistics as we know them, I think I'm just going to go ahead and do it. Plus, even if it is a bit weird, I like to think that every language has at least one weird feature that helps to lend it some character. So I think we can afford to be a bit adventurous here. So this single marker that simultaneously encodes the reflexive, the passive with a reintroduced agent, and the antipassive, I was trying to think about what to actually call it. I guess it might be called a middle, but I think I'm going to go with just detransitive, because that's essentially what it does. It just detransitivizes the verb, but exactly how and what the semantics of that are, you have to look at the case marking and the other words in the sentence to figure that out. Oh, also, for imperatives, it occurred to me that if you wanted to passivize an imperative, I think for an intransitive command, that would once again take the same indefinite subject marking that the auxiliary verbs do, and then you'd make use of the detransitive affix if you did want to reintroduce the agent. And once again, the infinitive is the only verb form in which the subject marking actually goes on the lexical verb, which, since it's an infinitive, it will only ever be one of these three. Unless we wanted to specifically add adjussive or something. Oh no, now that's tempting me. Oh well, I will consider that later. In the meantime, there is another pressing matter to attend to. And really, this is the reason why I decided to record this episode today. So throughout all of this stuff that happens with the nouns, we had kind of put possession on the back burner. Because remember, in the Protolang, there originally was a specific genitive case, but that genitive became the new accusative because of what happened with the auxiliary verbs, where the lexical verb was essentially interpreted as a verbal noun in a possessive relationship with its object. So that would mean, at this point, that the accusative not only marks direct objects, but also possessors. Like, say you had a sentence like, I see your dog. The way that would effectively be translated would be, I am at the seeing of you of your dog. So both the direct object, dog, and the possessor, you, would be in the genitive. So it's kind of ambiguous as to which of those is the possessor and which is the direct object because they're marked in the same case. So I expect there would be some strategy, at least an optional strategy, to clarify that relationship. And I was thinking about how I might want to do that. There are a couple of different ways we could handle it. We might say that another case, like maybe the dative, actually moves into the role of possession, or maybe some new postposition comes along to form like a possessive phrase, kind of like the Latin de did in the Romance languages, or maybe even evolving a new case to take over the old genitive. But all of those seemed a little bit bland to me, and I was kind of trying to figure out how we could do something a little bit more interesting. And then, purely by coincidence, earlier this week, I came across something awesome. For a completely unrelated reason, I was looking through a grammar of Ainu, and I came across how Ainu handles possession. So Ainu has multiple different possessive strategies, but the one that caught my eye, for nouns that are alienably possessed, like if you wanted to say, my dog, the standard way of saying that would be to put the possessor in a relative clause with the verb to have. So it would literally be, the dog that I have, which seems kind of clunky in English, because English's relative clause structure is kind of heavy. You've got this optional complementizer in there, and then you have to use a subject pronoun. But in Ainu, all you have to do is conjugate the verb in the first person, and then just stick it in front of the word dog. So it's just the I have dog. And I, for one, think that is awesome. And it seems like such an elegant way to solve this exact problem that we're having. Because I can totally see how, when these auxiliary verb constructions begin taking over, and you have the conflict between what counts as a possessive and what counts as a direct object, then I think a pretty easy, natural way of clarifying that would be with a relative clause. So instead of saying, I am at the seeing of you of the dog, you say, I am at the seeing of the dog that you have. I am completely in love with this idea, So I think I'm just going to go for it. Now, there are a couple of follow-up questions that naturally arise from that. The first one, how do relative clauses actually work in this language? I don't think I've said this on air, but I was thinking about maybe having a separate relative verb form in this language. Something like what happens in Turkish or Tamil or Swahili, where when the verb is part of a relative clause, it takes a special marker to specify, hey, all of the dependents of this verb are in a relative clause. And specifically, the Turkish example is kind of interesting, because the Turkish relative participle actually nominalizes the verb, and then the subject of the verb has to be marked in the genitive. So like if you wanted to say, the man who I saw, you would literally say, the my seeing man. And while that would be kind of fun, because then, in addition to all the other nonsensicality we have with all the case alternations going on, if the subject of a relative clause had to be in the genitive, that would lead to some really crazy shenanigans going on. But if we're going to go with this idea of having possession handled by a relative clause, I think that behooves us to make sure that the relativization strategy is fairly simple. Because the more stuff is involved in a relative clause, the less likely I think that would make the speakers to go for this as a natural way of specifying a possessor. Because there are a bunch of different ways that languages can construct relative clauses. You've got the relative pronoun strategy, which is what the vast majority of European languages do, where you have a word like who or which as far as I'm aware is actually virtually non-existent outside of Europe. Then you've got pronoun retention, where the noun that's shared between the two clauses, in the relative clause, it just turns into a pronoun. So to say something like, I saw the man who I met yesterday, in a language with pronoun retention, you would say, I saw the man I met him yesterday, where the man in the relative clause, or where the man would be in the relative clause, has just been replaced by him. And then you've got internally headed relative clauses, which frankly completely baffle me. I've read through a bunch of different papers trying to understand what's going on, and they're so confusing to me that I don't even trust myself to explain it properly. But just to give an example, if you wanted to say, I saw the man who I met yesterday, that would be, I met the man yesterday, where the full relative clause just takes over the spot where the referent is in the matrix clause. Now, I have no idea about the particulars of that, and it seems from the examples that I've seen, there doesn't seem to be very much marking going on to clarify things, and I don't know how you tell which noun in the relative clause is the thing that's actually being relativized. If someone can explain it to me, feel free. But anyway, in this case, to make the relative clause as light and simple as possible, I think we're going to stick with what is, thankfully, the most common and the most simple strategy, which is just gapping, which we can do in English as well as an optional strategy. So you can use a relative pronoun in English, like, I saw the man who I met yesterday, but you can also just omit the who and say, I saw the man I met yesterday. And that's perfectly valid as well. So in this case, there's no marking, there's no pronoun, it's just the two clauses next to each other, and the shared noun is deleted in the relative clause, and that's all you have to do. So doing that, number one, as I say, is a very, very common strategy to do that, but also doing that will help make this construction a lot more straightforward and more likely, so I'm going to stick with that. But also, the languages can have multiple different strategies. Like I just said, in English we have both gapping and the relative pronoun. But which strategy is used can sometimes depend on the context of what's going on and what the role of the referent is in the relative clause. Yeah, it's the relative clause. I always get that mixed up, but it's the relative clause, not the matrix clause. So there's actually a hierarchy. I think it's called the accessibility hierarchy, because in many languages there will be restrictions about what roles are allowed to be relativized. So at the top is the subject, and I can't imagine any language not allowing a subject to be relativized. That one is pretty universal. The vast majority of languages will also be happy to relativize a direct object. There are a couple, and I think Tagalog is one of them, that only allows the subject to be relativized. But most languages will also be happy to do the direct object too. The indirect object is a little bit less common than that, then the object of adpositional phrases is less common again. And I'm pretty sure that in Basque, you can only relativize these three, and everything below this on the hierarchy is not allowed. But then the rarest of all is the possessor. So the fact that in English we can say something like, I saw the man whose book I read. The fact that we've got that whose in there, and we're relativizing the man to say something about the book, that is very, very strange from a cross-linguistic perspective. Very few languages will be okay with that. So for this language, again, I don't think I said this on air, but I was toying around with the idea of only having subjects being able to be relativized, because we've got our abundant valency changing operations that will naturally help us to jump any given argument into subject position anyway. So that wouldn't be too much of a problem or too restrictive. But if we want to do this and have possession handled by a relative clause, if we were sticking with only relativizing subjects, then that would mean this construction as it is wouldn't work. Because in the dog that I have, the dog is an object. I'm the one who has the dog. So if you can only relativize a subject, you'd have to passivize the verb. So you'd have to say, the dog that is had by me, which would mean that you would have to add at least another syllable to the verb, and then you'd have to reintroduce the agent as an oblique, and that would, once again, make the construction longer and clunkier, which we don't want. So I think I'm going to say, for now, that the subject and the direct object can be relativized, and that both of them can be handled just by gapping. So that will keep this construction very simple and easy. The other question that arises out of this is the question of alienability. Because I can totally see that with this sort of construction, the verb have, for example, may be used for just one of these two, and the other one would take a different verb. So it seems like a pretty easy way to get a distinction between these two. So yes, to have is the obvious one, but maybe it comes from an older sense of to carry, or hold, or to bear, something like that. You can pretty naturally see how that could arrive at a meaning of to have something. Whereas for inalienable, what could give rise to an inalienable verb? Oh, hold on. I think I got it. So it occurs to me that in a lot of languages, the way that you do a to have construction, like just off the top of my head in Turkish, if you wanted to say like, I have a dog, you would say I in the locative, dog in the nominative, and then locative copula. So it would literally be, there is a dog at me. But of course the locative copula is an intransitive verb, and it wouldn't make very much sense to use in a construction like this. That would literally be, the dog that I exist, which doesn't make very much sense. But then, of course, we have our valency changing operations, and specifically, we have applicatives. So if we take the locative copula and add, say, a commitative applicative, that would create a meaning of to exist with or to be with. That's pretty cool. And that, I think, has a lot less of a sense of alienability to it than to carry, which is much more obviously alienable. And the cool part is, we already have the locative copula because we derived it for these auxiliary verb forms. So we could basically just go through and derive this right now. So this possessive form would actually be pretty much identical to these forms of the auxiliary, except with an applicative on the end. So our work is already basically half done for us. So the question is then, does this possessive construction distinguish the simple and the reduplicated forms? So basically, is there an imperfective and a perfective distinction in possessives? So the I am having dog versus the I had dog. My immediate answer is no. I'm thinking it would only keep the short stem, just because I'm thinking if this takes over as the standard way of marking possession, and if the reduplication thing inherently gets tied up with the form of the lexical verb anyway, of course you would still be able to say the dog that I had, but that would require the auxiliary and then some other verb to take over the role of the lexical verb. Whereas this form would just sort of get fossilized and grammaticalized as just a possessive word, and they wouldn't really think of it as a verb in its own right anymore. Come to think of it, if we wanted to go really crazy, we could use other verbs as well for other more nuanced types of possession. We could kind of do a Fijian type thing and have one for like edible possession and drinkable possession and all sorts of other forms like that. Something else to think about. So I guess let's derive that applicative then. So I still haven't properly decided about what applicatives are going to be in this language. For now, let's just go along with the idea that there is a separate commitative applicative in this language, even though it'll probably get mixed in with the instrumental, but let's just go with that for now. So applicatives are really easy to evolve. I basically did it by accident in Okalawak. You basically just need an adposition that has a similar meaning to what the applicative is, and then just have the adposition glom onto the verb. So like, I eat with a spoon, the eat and the with just sort of combine together, merge into each other, and you get a new verb, eat with. Pretty much as simple as that. So we want a commitative meaning to say to exist with. And I'm pretty sure we said that adpositions are going to be verb-like in this language, just because I find verb-like adpositions a lot easier to deal with. So we could have an adposition meaning with come from a verb like take. You can see that, like, you could say something like, I go home, take John, and that means I go home with John. So that's pretty straightforward. So we need to coin a verb that used to mean take in the proto-lang, that gives us a commitative applicative that ideally is not very heavy. Something that won't add more than one syllable, or ideally one segment. So I was messing around with some potential verb forms earlier, and I quite like this one. I was trying purposefully to get us some more O's, because I feel like there's been a deficiency of O's. Too many E's, not enough E's. And I also like the variety that this one turned out with. So the root then would be rutta, which the voiced uvula disappears, and when word final vowel loss happens, that A will be lost. So it will usually, by the time of the modern lang, just be like a suffixed T. So that one seems like it could work. Let's try that. So in the proto-lang of roughed in, it meant to take, but it also had an at least a commitative meaning, maybe some other meanings as well, but for now we'll just say it's commitative. So we take the akya form. But wait a minute. The word order, at least in the proto-lang, is SOV, which means that any postpositional phrases will come before the verb, and postpositions obviously come after their objects. So it'd be like, I spoon with eat. So when the postpositions form into applicatives, they will be prefixes. Well, let's go with that and see how that changes things. But if they are prefixes then, that would mean they'd have to affix on before the subject marking. So, like, with eat would already need to be a lexical item and viewed as its own verb form before subject marking happens. So these applicatives will be quite old. So let's say that even in the very early stages of the proto-lang, these had already combined together. And I am mindful of the stress, and I'm saying that it falls on the postposition. So like, kutaakya becomes kutakya. That makes sense to me. Well, then let's apply the subject prefixes, and let's see how Lexigy handles that. Oh wow, look at this. I have no idea why it's giving us that WTS ending. Yeah, something funky is definitely happening. Well, I'm going to figure out what's wrong with that later, and for now I'm just going to do it manually. Okay, let's see if we can blaze through these quickly. So the uvula stop disappears. The S turns into an R, the U takes over the syllable, the T and the palatal stop come next to each other, and the palatal stop turns into an S, then word final vowel loss, metathesis, and epenthesis. Qererit. Ugh. That's not great. Oh, wait, no, I forgot. The whole reason we did that was that the uvula stop lowers the U to an O. That will spread rounding harmony across the whole root. Qerorut. Still not great. I might cheat a little bit and just say that the second R gets skipped over, which, since this thing is shortening up into the standard possessive marker anyway, I think that might be acceptable. Then this would be the same thing, except with the consonants swapped out. And in that case, we could theoretically apply the same cheat to all of these forms, I think. The voiced uvula geminates the previous sound when it drops out. Oh, that one's ugh. Ororot. This idea of shortening is becoming more and more appealing. With this one, maybe we could ditch the D as well. We've got some syncretism going on with these two, because in either case, the person marker would just assimilate straight into the stressed oo, or in this case, o. That's between the human singular and the animate singular, so I think that's completely fine. Okay, I think that would be more or less what the forms would be. what immediately strikes me is how radically, unrecognizably different they are from just the verb stem on its own without the applicative. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. And I'm pretty sure I will invoke some form of shortening. Because again, if it's used frequently enough, then shortening is wont to happen. I think I'm going to have to dwell on that off-air and decide whether or not I like it, because I'm running short on time for right now. One quick thing I should mention before I forget is, with this relative clause structure, since the proto-lang is exclusively head final, we could justify the relative clauses as either coming before or after. Because even though generally with head final languages, modifiers and modifying phrases like relative clauses typically come before the nouns, relative clauses are quite heavy, and so they often naturally end up coming afterwards anyway. It's about a 50-50 split, I think, between head final languages with relative clauses before versus after the noun. And some may allow both. Like in Turkish, I think the sort of standard strategy is to have it come beforehand, but they've actually borrowed a construction from Persian, where you use a little particle ki that allows you to place the relative clause after the noun if you want. So for this language, I'm thinking that most of the time relative clauses will come afterwards, but in the case of these possessive words, since they're ideally very short and simple, they can remain in a prenominal position. So to say, the man's dog, the order would be man, to have in the human singular, and then dog. So I'm coming up on time for this episode, and I think that is a pretty good place to stop, because I need to think about how exactly I want to handle these forms. But hopefully, by the next episode, we'll have forms for both of these, and then we can crack on with some other verb stuff. So thanks again for watching. Look out for that Q&A at some point relatively soon, and I will see you then.